Race seems to have the most significant bearing on biases and perceptions in South Africa. Similarly, levels of education, religious affiliation tend to have influence on the perceptions people have of themselves. Now, these were the findings of a study by University of Johannesburg economics lecturer Frederich Kirsten. Now, the study looked at the correlation between how one views themselves and how they view inequality and how they position themselves in the South African unequal system. Now, the assertion is that similar studies have shown that perceptions drive voting behaviour and other political attitudes. Frederich joins us in studio now, University of Johannesburg economics lecturer. Hopefully we can find out why it is important to study this political, social and class dynamic in South Africa. So nice to have you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Since you've put out the study, it's been a flurry of people wanting to talk to you and sort of just understand the machinations behind all of this. So talk to us. What made you put this together, the study?
Yes, so the motivation behind it, like I said, there's been a lot of talk about it and some interest in the news. And one really important motivation behind it is South Africa is struggling with high inequality. We have a struggling middle class, but there's also a strong perception of South Africans to place themselves in the middle of society. So class and status don't really align at the moment, meaning we place ourselves in different positions in our actual class position. And that is actually the driving force here, is how we have biased perceptions in our class perception. And that was the main driver here. And then I said to myself, let's look at some of the South African context, because we know the history of South Africa, and we know before 1994, race was driving class. But now after 1994, although racial inequality is high, actually now the class is more racially integrated. So because there's a lot of more different components to it since the previously disadvantaged population groups moved up the social ladder from 1994.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, when we go back to 1994, I mean, there really was this hope and this whole talk about this rainbow nation and this united country that is going to come together and prove that this can all be done. But many attribute perhaps that maybe that little bit of naivety that could actually work going into where we are now.
Yes.
And sort of the manifestation of all of that is the things that are happening right now in this year, 2023. Can we look at that? I mean, can we draw a lot of things out of that?
Yes, we can. I think in the end, social mobility is quite low, for especially people at the lower end of society. They're not moving up. And that's where this study also looks at what do you need to move up the social ladder, and also looking at perceptions, because I think for a long time we've ignored perceptions. We've looked at objective measures like the Gini coefficient and all of these objective measures of inequality. But do we really know how people perceive inequality, where they would place themselves in the society? Because those are the main driving forces for people to take action, because that influences your behavior and your voting behavior, demand for redistribution, and in also your action towards class conflict, social unrest.
Yeah. So let's break it down, because it's quite interesting to see what you've written here is, and this is according to your study, and I want to know how you come up with this. Coloured, Indian and white South Africans have a tendency to inflate their social positions beyond what is objectively true.
Yes.
Help me here. What are you meaning by this?
So by that I mean that they position themselves higher up than their actual economic position. So when they look at themselves in society, they would maybe place themselves in the middle or the topper part of society, but then they will actually belong lower. And the thing there is to see that although they inflate themselves, there's also a large group that deflate themselves within that same population group. So it's mostly not the inflated perceptions that's so important, but actually the fact that there's this biased perception, meaning you're deviating away from your actual position. And the whole reasoning behind it is based on the reference groups. Like, who do you compare yourself to when you place yourself in society? Because that has become more complex in South Africa since 1994, because it's racially integrated now. You don't just compare yourself to people, your neighbors, but now you compare yourself to other people's different population groups. And that has changed the dynamics in South Africa about where do you place yourself, and if it's a wrong position based on your economic position in society.
I mean, it is quite interesting, because at the same time, as you say, those groupings, coloured, Indian and white South Africans, inflate social status. Black people tend to underestimate their position Again, is this a legacy? I mean, we use this all the time,
Yes.
legacy of apartheid. Is it still something that perhaps does do this?
Yes, the lingering effects of apartheid can still be seen maybe in class and status, because we still have a high racial inequality, and I think you can still see it in status perceptions. And the argument there, which was not my argument, but one of the arguments in the studies, in the literature, was the fact that the black middle class don't want to see themselves in a predominantly white, historically white middle class, and thus they underestimate their position in society.
Why? I mean, what is the reasoning behind this?
So the reasoning behind it is that you maybe don't want to perceive yourself in the historically white middle class, and you still want to perceive yourself with your own population group. And we know that a large share of those at the lower class of society still is made up from previously disadvantaged population groups. So it's almost a tendency to still view yourself with your own population group. And again, it goes back to the reference group. Who do you compare yourself to? Do you compare yourself to people in different population groups, or do you compare yourself to people in the same population group?
Yeah. So besides race, I mean, there's so much more
Yes.
to it, because you also bring into it education and religion.
Yes.
And these are also proving to be prominent in people's perceptions of
Yeah.
themselves. So help me understand that. I mean, because I'm a certain religion, do I put myself above others? Education? That I get, because I know there are very arrogant people out there that think, oh, well, you know, I've studied everything and I know everything. Meantime,
Yeah.
you know, that's kind of what people do.
Yeah.
It's always been like that, but it's not necessarily the truth. So help me understand the aspect of religion and education.
Well, education, as we can say, it's quite obvious. If you see yourself, if the more maybe educated you are, the more you might know about inequality in South Africa, and then you might place yourself in the correct position. Where the fact of the matter is also, I think people with higher education, they deflate their position, and that is based on they compare themselves to friends around them with the same education, and they place themselves in the middle, while in truth they're actually higher up. Now, with the religion factor, it's actually very interesting, because there's so many things influencing your perceptions. It maybe can be the humbleness factor, where you place yourselves lower in society because you don't want to place yourself on step 9 or 10. Because you say, no, I place myself lower on society, maybe because of your religion, maybe because of the maybe something in your religion that gives that humbleness factor, where you don't want to self-enrich yourself, look at yourself as higher ups in society.
Yeah.
So there's so many different dynamics towards that.
You know what? I should have asked you this right at the beginning, but I'm sort of slotting it in here. How did this work? What's your methodology? I mean, how many people did you sort of bring together? How
Yes.
did you analyze this, and over what period of time?
Yes, so it's there's a survey data of 3,000 people being used for each survey. That's 2009 and 2019. That was already pre-collected secondary data. But the question that really is important is the one on the social step ladder, where you tell someone, okay, imagine a 10-step ladder, with the richest person you know being on top, the poorest person you know being at the bottom on step 1. Where would you place yourself? So now the person actually creates their own inequality in their mind, view of inequality, and then they place themselves in that unequal system. So they look at themselves and they say, okay, who's the richest in my life, who's the poorest, and that I know about, and then you place yourself in society.
And that's sort of, and then once they've placed themselves, is that where you start asking the questions, and, you know, like, why do you put yourself here? You
Yes.
look at them, their environment, their race, their religion,
Yes.
their monetary status,
Yes.
and then you kind of understand why they have slotted themselves in there.
Yeah, some of my other work has actually looked at the determinants behind that, what drives it, and how that drives other social behavior like social unrest, demand for distribution, political attitudes almost.
But isn't it quite amazing that it's all based on almost like a monetary thing?
Yes.
Is that you are comparing yourself to the richest person you know,
Yes.
and then you're slotting yourself on that ladder. So
Yes.
it's kind of it's all about status.
Yes, it's all about status.
Has much changed in the world? I mean, is this something new? Hasn't this been
No.
around forever?
Yes, no, this has been around from the days of Max Weber. Marx also worked on that. And it's all about what drives that alignment between class and status. Because if you place yourself in a certain society or a certain position, are you actually part of that class? And if you're not, then you maybe have biased perceptions towards other political attitudes
So let's talk politics now.
Yes.
In and amongst all of that,
Yes.
what does that mean for the political status here in South Africa? And almost determining, because I can imagine political parties also use this as a ploy. And they do. We know they do. We know that political parties play with us. And we're fighting amongst ourselves when we see what's happening up there. And then it all becomes very much so what you're talking about. So talk to us about how this filters into politics.
So the one element that it actually influences, according to the studies, is voting behaviour, which is quite important, and your demand for redistribution. But really in South Africa, there's so many different elements towards voting behaviour that we don't understand yet. But in this this section, it actually contributes to the fact that these perceptions drive your political behavior, which might influence the voting behavior later on and moving forward. And there's a lot of theory about it, about what people need, the subjective needs of the people that are explored via these theories, because they are sometimes ignored by objective measures in what do people need. There's a theory by some popular economist about expected upward mobility, where if you give someone money, but they expect a job and they're low social mobility, then they will not be satisfied with the money. They will still drive towards social change, justice, even though they get some money. And that is where this subjective thing comes in, to ask, what do the people really need in order for them to feel that they're moving up on the social ladder?
Interesting one, and I'm reading sort of an analysis here of the Democratic Alliance and how voters and everybody fits into this one, because some of the reasoning is that from what we're saying is that the observations is the status itself is driven by these lingering legacies.
Yes.
And could be the reason why black voters still don't really want to vote for the DA. I'm not saying all, but just, you know, in terms of some of the observations that you've made, maybe it's class identity that differs from the class identity of the leadership structure and the representation within the DA. Help me understand this.
Yes, that can be actually one of the theories behind it. So there's a possibility that it can be one of the reasons, although there's other things that influences that. But that link between race, class, and status is so vast and so underexplored that this is almost just opening the tap into it, looking at really what is the impact. And again, we go back to the reference group, is where you compare yourself to, because do you compare yourself to racially integrated reference groups, which we see now these days, or do you rather stick with your own population group when you compare yourself? And then that will also drive where you want to place yourself, the political attitude you might hold, and all of that. So I think there's definitely a link, but maybe I cannot confirm that link. I would just like to say it does explain part of that, maybe.
Yeah, quite interesting. It really is. It makes you think about things.
Yes.
But I haven't touched on gender, because we may have spoken education, we may have spoken race, religion, and perhaps your wealth status. But what about gender and where women fall into all of this? I'd be quite interested to know how they slot themselves on that ladder.
Yes. So one thing that we need to note from the study, we don't include anyone that's unemployed. It was just employed, because it's so difficult in South Africa to look at the statuses of the unemployed given limited data sets. But if you look at this data set and the gender, you would see that women do tend to deflate their position in society, and again also inflate. So there's again a large difference between the two, like in the terms of the fact that you get certain women that deflate, certain women that inflate, but that's also based on where do you place yourself according to your reference group.
Amazing, very interesting. Religions, which are our arrogant religions?
Yeah.
Christians and Muslims, I believe. I'm reading here saying that people who are Christian or Muslim tend to inflate their perceptions of themselves.
Yeah, like the word inflate can mean like you're self-confident about yourself, but it's actually just the concept of you look at your group from 1 to 10, the person you see richest and poorest, and you actually place yourself by mistake higher up. You play by mistake, and it's just almost a by mistake because you don't have a complete view of inequality in South Africa. So it's almost rather about by mistake than by arrogance.
So this, I mean, I think people must go and read it themselves. I mean, there's so much and a lot that you've uncovered in this study. So just tell me, I mean, I imagine a few studies around the world have been done like this that are very, very similar.
Yes.
Have you sort of shared this with your international counterparts and those that have done other similar studies, and how do we compare?
Yeah, no, I haven't shared it with the counterparts, but I've looked at other studies done in the USA, especially where there's this tolerance for inequality at the moment and the voting behavior and so on. And they actually look at this bias perception as a strong determinant of voting behavior and found a significant relationship between voting behavior for either the Democratic or Republican parties and this bias perceptions. Because they would believe the whole thing there is that if you inflate your position, then you place yourself higher up than what you actually are. And then you would actually demand less redistribution because you would want less taxes. But in truth, you would gain from more taxes. So that's where your perceptions change your political attitudes, because you misperceive yourself high up and then you don't want more taxes. But in truth, you would actually gain from more taxes.
Amazing. Well, go out there, find it, give a search. Where can we find your full study?
Oh, yes, it's on Sociological Inquiry Journal.
Okay.
And you can find it there, and you can all just request a hard copy from me or soft copy from me.
Amazing. I know, actually, if you just Google Frederich Kirsten's name, you'll actually find it as well. And there's lots of articles as well that deconstruct it. So Frederich Kirsten, University of Johannesburg economics lecturer, talking to us about a study that found that race, education and religion determine how people view themselves and others in South Africa, with race having the most significance on bias and perceptions in the country.